Hello, everybody, and hello, anybody who's online. My name's Deborah Howard, and I'm enormously honoured to introduce my friend and colleague from Venice, Gianmario Guidarelli. We've worked together for a long time on various projects, and I need to tell you a little bit about his life. I have to abbreviate it a bit because he's done so many things. He's incredibly prolific and active. He's an architect, that's important. He's Associate Professor in Architectural History in the University of Padua in the Engineering Department, and also Professor of Religious Architecture at the Divinity School in Padua. He has an undergraduate degree from UAV, the Architecture School in Venice, and did his PhD in Venice also. He's taught at Duke University in America and at UAV in Venice and in Verona and various other places for his position in Padua. And his project, which he's going to tell you about today, is funded by the Italian system PRIN, a big research grant called Coenobium, Art and Architecture of the Casinese Benedictine Congregation from the 15th to the 18th centuries, Digital and Spatial Analysis Strategies through BIM Models. Sounds terrifying, but I'm sure it'll be wonderful. Another wonderful project of Gianmario's is this series called Chiesa di Venezia, which is a project which looks every year at a different little studied church in Venice, has a conference, and then publishes a book. And we've now done, what, 13 or something like that? Yeah. So it's thanks to Gianmario's extraordinary persistence and intelligence and organizational gifts that this has continued. He's doing various other collaborative projects, but I think there's too many to tell you. His first book was about the Scuola Grande di San Rocco, which was published in 2015. He also co-wrote a book on Tintoretto and architecture, and he's written lots of articles on medieval architecture, Renaissance architecture, early modern religious architecture, especially Benedictine, and the theology of landscape. And today he's going to be talking about Andrea Palladio and San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice, and can't wait to hear it. Gianmario.
Va bene così? Yes. Yeah. Sorry, can you help me with the, sorry, to, okay.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, so now we just, oh,
this one, sorry.
Move it, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Good morning, and thank you to the to Deborah Howard for presentation. And above all, I would like to thank Frank Salmon, Elizabeth Deans, and Deborah Howard for inviting me to give this seminar. For me, it's not only a great honor, but also an exceptional opportunity to discuss and exchange ideas about the research that is still ongoing. And this is the topic of my next book. San Giorgio Maggiore is considered one of Andrea Palladio's masterpieces and one of the most important churches in defining a new type of sacred building after the Council of Trent. Many studies, starting with those by James Ackerman, Vladimir Timofievich, and Christoph Frommel, have highlighted the relationship between the plan of San Giorgio Maggiore and the debate between centralized and longitudinal layouts that was taking place in Rome at the construction site of St. Peter Basilica in Vatican. More recently, researches by Andrea Guerra, Guido Beltramino, and Tracy Cooper have highlighted the difficulty in reconstructing Palladio's original design. In particular, there are still many doubts about the choir of the church and the facade, both built after Palladio's death in 1581 and 1610 respectively. In this paper, I propose to respond to these doubts by adopting a different method for investigation, which takes into account two contextual factors that have been almost completely ignored until now. On the one hand, the relationship between Palladio's design and existing physical structure can be reconstructed through recent archaeological investigations in conjunction with the analysis of unpublished sources, as well as the use of already known sources. But they can also be studied in an innovative way thanks to digital technologies, in particular georeferencing and 3D modeling, in particular building information modeling. On the other hand, I propose to interpret Palladio's design and the construction history of the church within the context of the architectural practices established by the Cassinese Benedictine congregation, to which the monastic community of San Giorgio Maggiore belonged. The paper will reveal Palladio to be an architect who is much more attentive to context than we have previously realized, and who, in order to meet the complex needs of a monastic community, adopts a new open form of design, a flexible form of design. In fact, I would like to demonstrate that the design and management of the San Giorgio Maggiore construction site may have been strongly influenced by the monks, who not only imposed design choice based on their needs as a client, it's normal, but also formulated a design program that the architect had to implement. The mindset of these Venetian monks is based on medieval tradition, but also on the reform of monastic life conceived by Abbot Ludovico Barbo at the beginning of the 15th century. This reform led to the development of a new architectural type of monastery, of which San Giorgio Maggiore is one of the most examples. The study of the Venetian monastery, in fact, is a part of a more general research project coordinated by me on the architectural culture of the Cassinese congregation founded by Ludovico Barbo in the Renaissance. The aim of my project, Cenobium, is the study of the architectural and the artistic culture of the Cassinese congregation from a comparative perspective, thanks to the innovative use of the digital humanities. And please, if you want to see the first results of this project, you can visit our website, digitalcenobium.eu. I will show in this context of the congregation and the architecture of the congregation, I will show how Palladio's construction of the refectory and church of San Giorgio Maggiore is conditioned by this mindset, in particular by the need to set up a construction site inside an active monastery, and how Palladio uses these constraints to set up a flexible design adapted to a dynamic decision-making progress by the monks. San Giorgio Maggiore is one of the oldest monasteries in Venice. According to Francesco Sansovino, at the time of the first Benedictine community following the donation of Doge Tribuno Memmo, 5th century, the existing church was rebuilt together with the new monastery. The church, rebuilt again in the 13th century and renovated another time by the abbot Giovanni Michiel by 1519, is the one visible in the view of Venice by Jacopo de Barbari, surrounded by a complex system of cloisters, with the construction site of the new dormitory in a full swing. You can see here the new dormitory. The monastery portrayed in the woodcut by Jacopo de Barbari had been renovated in the previous century following the entry of the community, the Venetian community, into the congregation De Unitate, founded by Ludovico Barbo, definitively formalized in 1429. In particular, from the 1440s onward, the increase in numbers of monks made it necessary to plan the reconstruction of an entire cloister, the refectory and the dormitory. This building program, however, only materialized in 1494 with the opening of the construction site of the dormitory designed by Giovanni Buora, and you can see here the construction site. The study of a map that I published 2 years ago describing the complex of San Giorgio Maggiore in its late 15th century, in the same year, I think, of the woodcut by Jacopo de Barbari, in this late 15th century state, allows us to reconstruct its real shape in this moment, before the arrival of Palladio. The map preserved in the in the State Archives of Venice depicts the monastery with a great precision before the complex was completely rebuilt at the beginning of the 16th century. By analyzing the evidence, we cataloged the information provided by the drawing with the use of digital humanities. The isolation of the numerous elements classified and differentiated in the AutoCAD software, it's a software used by architects, in superimposed layers allows us to hypothesize the temporal sequence of the graphic execution of this drawing and to understand the subsequent phases of use of the design. By comparing this 2-dimensional image with other 3-dimensional views on the same area and with a large number of archival sources, we were able to create a digital model of the monastery and the entire island. We discovered that the plan later became a basic scheme on which to insert subsequent intervention. In particular, in the central part of the drawing, a sketch was drawn with the plan of a new church. You can see here in our reconstruction. It is the original design, and it is the digital elaboration of the design. This is with the plan of a new church, which coincides with the one designed in 1520. This is the design of a new church not built, and you can see a new sketches based on the design of a new church. So we used this map like with a decisional process, a dynamic decisional process. The georeferencing of the map was useful for attributing all the information relating to their geographical location to the historical graphic data, and for comparing the situation of the 15th century with the current one. We were thus able to demonstrate for the first time that the plan of the medieval monastery is completely different from the shape of the current monastery after its Renaissance reconstruction. The plan depicts a monastic complex with a church with 3 main aisles separated by rows of square supports that could be pair of columns pedestal and apparently a sub-aisle. You can see here and here. The presbytery consisted of 3 chapels separated from the aisles by partitions, on which the southern one is rectangular and the other 2 are apsed. In front of the church, there are 2 cloisters which already existed in the 13th century. And the views you can see here in red, the actual system, the current situation, and in black, the reconstruction of the situation of the last 15th century. In front of the church, there are 2 cloisters which already existed in the 13th century. The views of Jacopo de Barbari, here, Giovanni Andrea Vavassore, and Andrea Pagan, despite some perspective distortions, portrayed them as two large courtyards located between the entrance area on the west bank of the island and the church, with a different conformation that would suggest that they were built at separate times. As we'll see in this, in this digital reconstruction, this was the shape of the monastery in 1411. Entry into the congregation resulted in a rapid growth of novices in the Venetian monastery, which soon imposed a general reconfiguration of the spaces. In the Pacta, decreed in 1429 for entry of the cenobium in the congregation, Abbot Michiel describes a reconstruction project for the entire monastery with the construction of a new dormitory, cum claustro, to the south, while in the western part of the island, the monks would build a guest house and an infirmary. This is an overall and systematic program of reconfiguration of the monastery, which would be precisely implemented over the following decades, starting with the reorganization of the northern and western front of the island. With the construction of the northern dormitory, visible on this map of the early 16th century, of the guest house and infirmary, of the southern dormitory, I think for novices, of the refectory that you can see here in this unpublished by me map for the first time. This is the design of the new refectory and of a new library that we can see here in the Jacopo de Barbari view. The reconstruction program set up by Michiel and carried out by his successor abbots in the following 2 centuries is perfectly consistent with the principle that all the abbots of the congregation founded by Ludovico Barbo followed when they had to rebuild their monasteries. During the second half of the 15th century, the congregation de Unitate and after Cassin's congregation became a network of monasteries which, thanks to the centralization of building policy, the circulation of materials, architects, and architectural ideas, a standardization of liturgical practices, and the development of a common architectural language, became an important protagonist of monastic architecture of the 16th century, and I think also an important protagonist in general of the Italian Renaissance. This happens above all because the expanding membership of the congregation and the rapid growth in the numbers of monks requires the reconstruction of numerous urban and extra-urban monasteries, favored by prudent economic management. You can see here the growth, the exceptional growth of the congregation from the 15th and 16th century. The consequence is the formation of a common architectural culture, which until now has been the subject of studies by scholars such as James Ackerman, Marianne Winkelmes, and Guido Beltramini, and me. This shared architectural culture is based on a monastic tradition renewed by Ludovico Barbo, founder of the Reformed Congregation of Santa Giustina, or the Unitate. From the first years of its history, the Congregation de Unitate was characterized by a complementary rethinking of the monk's individual life, where the spiritual ascent of contemplative activity implied a temporary and partial isolation of the monk. In Ludovico Barbo's vision, the monastic cell, became the chosen place for the monk's meditation, study, and personal prayer, as reiterated in the Declaratorium Regulae Benedictine, which indicates the need to divide the dormitory into single cells, so that the brothers can practice prayers and other spiritual exercise. The consequent multiplication of the numbers of cells led to need to develop a new planimetric organization of the monastery. Thus, we begin to see a different relationship between the community environment, refectory, library, chapter house, workshop, etc., and the individual cell. This phenomenon of architectural renewal took place at the turn of the 15th century, starting right at the heart of the congregation, on the occasion of the almost simultaneous opening of several construction sites of monasteries in northern Italy, mainly Santa Giustina Padua, the modern cenobium of the congregation, Praglia Abbey, and San Benedetto Po. In all these cases, it was a question of rebuilding pre-existing monasteries, which, once they entered on the congregation, experienced a rapid repopulation with dozens and dozens of new monastic professions per year. One of the solutions adopted in this construction site to arrange dozens of cells is a dormitory layout in a straight line with a full height central corridor and rows of cells on the sides, according to a model used in Santa Giustina Padua, we can see here, already developed in the convents of the mendicant orders in the Middle Ages. And I think it's very important, this link with the mendicant model. Mendicant model who substitute a unique room for dormitory, like for example in Cistercian monasteries, in a series of cells. But, so it's important, Santa Giustina is one of the prototypes of this new model, architectural model of dormitory, but it's above all in San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice that this model found its definitive form in a gigantic dimensions in the Manica Lunga. This project, developed by Giovanni and Andrea Buora, included a central vaulted aisle consisting of a double-eight corridor interrupted by a short transept. Here, you can see here, a short transept, and flanked by 2 rows of single cells. The new monastery was completely different from the old medieval complex. As we can see in this drawing that I still showed, the new monastery in red could completely replace the old monastery without reusing any of its building. However, by moving the entire monastery to the south of the island, a rational replacement of existing rooms could be implemented with the new buildings that would have inherited their function, while the entire complex remained habitable. In short, it was a question of managing an inhabited construction site in which the sequence of the various components had to be perfectly planned, also providing for a rapid rotation of the abbots, which was a peculiar characteristic of the congregation in all the construction sites of the congregation. In the case of San Giorgio Maggiore, all these criteria are followed perfectly. For example, in this new monastery of the congregation in general, the refectory was oversized compared to the effective number of monks in this new monastery. In fact, according to the legislation drawn up by the congregation, the refectory expanded their function as a collective space for the single local monastery, often also welcoming the annual general chapters of the entire congregation, as for example in Praglia and Santa Giustina, and therefore growing in size beyond the real needs of the single local monastery. These are Praglia and Santa Giustina, the prototypes that Palladio could date to follow in 1560 when he designed the refectory of San Giorgio Maggiore. Moreover, it was conditioned by the walls already largely built. This is a problem of context. And reuse the pre-existence, a wide staircase in this fantastic, exceptional project by Palladio. A wide staircase leads to a first grand portal through which you enter a vestibule. A second portal leads into the large hall. The latter is covered by a grandiose barrel vault, I think the first barrel vault in bricks in Venice, that turns into a cross to allow the opening of two thermal windows. The design is evidently inspired by the vaults of ancient Roman baths, but also the refectories of the congregation that are already been built, like Santa Giustina and Praglia. The imposition of a common norm of the congregation and the development of an architectural culture is especially important for the construction of churches. In fact, on the occasion of the reconstruction of the churches of the congregation, the development of a new architectural solution is clearly aimed in creating a spatial parametric model peculiar to the congregation, according to a process that can be followed in its general lines throughout the second half of the 15th century. The design of increasingly complex organisms is based on a basilica scheme with a sequence of domes in the minor aisles. The main nave, on the other hand, is covered by a barrel vault, interrupted, however, by domes at the transept, but also at the entrance, like, for example, San Sisto in Piacenza, or in the middle of its development, like San Benedetto in Ferrara. These lines of development of a church model peculiar of the congregation are concretized by the reconstruction of the Paduan Basilica of Santa Giustina. In this exceptional construction site, in the panorama of the Italian Renaissance, the succession of projects and variation in progress demonstrates how far the design ideas developed in a few decades, because this building was to become the prototype for all the other sister churches of the congregation. Proto Andrea da Valle designed a basilica plan with 3 aisles, with side chapels and a presbytery. Here, the intersection of the main nave and transept generates 3 pairs of peripheral chapels. A resolution of 1520 required all churches in the congregation to follow this model. From this moment, all churches have to follow this model. The first church that was designed following this criteria was probably that of San Giorgio Maggiore, depicted in this project of 1520. Not built, but only designed. This is a basilica divided into 3 naves with apsidal side chapels, like the chapels of the previous church, the previous medieval church, a transept with 3 domes and a 4th dome in the presbytery. Here. According to this project, the pre-existing church and the opposite cloisters should have been completely demolished, and these churches was not built, in fact. This is the situation that you can see here, the relationship with this project and the medieval monastery. You can see we have not a relationship. So the medieval monastery will be demolished. This is the situation that Palladio had to resolve when construction of the new church finally began. Next to the dormitory and the first cloister, completed by Bob Buora 30 years earlier, the entire pre-existing monastery still existed. You can see the construction by Buora. A series of unpublished graphic and archival sources shows that to build the new church, the monks had to demolish it only 2 of the medieval cloisters and the western part of the Romanesque church. That is, the choir that was to remain in use as long as possible to allow the daily prayer of the monks. You can see here the choir of the old church. Palladio, therefore, had to organize a construction site that would have to progressively make space with demolition to be carried out as the part of the new church were built. Thus, Palladio's project was conditioned by the need to temporarily maintain parts of the old church and the old monastery. It's not as easy situation for an architect. The plan elaborated by Palladio in 1564 adopts some aspect of the Paduan scheme of the Cassinese church. It is a basilica plan divided into 3 naves, marked by a sequence of piers with transept, which share the same height and width of the main nave roof, consisting with a grandiose barrel vault with lunettes. The central core of the building is formed by the domed crossing on 4 piers, here, which generates a sort of vast ambulatory consisting of the 2 apse transept. In the last span of the nave system and the eastern span placed between the transept and the presbytery. The reciprocal relationship between these spaces, which recall the ancient Roman baths in their majestic concatenation, is achieved thanks to the use of 2 architectural orders. And the same aerial tribune on which the organ would be built. Each of the 2 orders, minor and major, correspond to an entablature that runs along the entire space of the church. The entablature of the minor order constitutes the imposition of the cross walls that cover the aisles and the 2 side chapels of the presbytery, but also appears as 2 horizontal bands in the apsis of the transept. It is a perfect construction of 2 orders with a hierarchy of spaces. This complex but effective use of 2 interacting orders allows Palladio to develop in an organic way an integration between the church model with a centralized plan and one with a basilica scheme, centralized and longitudinal schemes. It was a solution that Roman architects had also been working out for decades for the completion of the new San Pietro in Vatican. Palladio, in his Roman travels, had certainly known the project of Raphael, for example. In this sense, the plan of San Giorgio Maggiore appears as a sequence of clearly distinct spaces, each with a different function and separated by the other by a series of steps. The body of the church reserved for the faithful, with short naves and a dome at the crossing, and with apsidal transept, the square presbytery for liturgical celebrations, the choir for the monks placed in a first moment beyond the diaphragm of columns. Yet, according to Andrea Guerra's reconstruction, Palladio's initial project did not include either the presbytery on the current end of the current choir of the monks by a termination in the form of column barrier, perhaps an exedra, as possible, which would have allowed the conservation of the shrine of the medieval building, with the altar dedicated to St. Stephen and the stall of the monks. The georeferencing of the 15th century map in black overlaid with the current state confirm that this was made possible by the size and perimeter that Palladio had given to this church compared in the pre-existing model buildings. A recent georadar survey conducted by me confirmed that traces of the original walls are still visible beneath the church floor. This survey also showed that Palladio raised the church on a high podium filled with rubble from the original medieval church and cloister, which were demolished in the mid-16th century. Now, thanks to a new archival investigation, it was being possible to confirm that the old choir of the medieval church remains in use at least until 1579. And you can see here the old choir, the first part of the church by Palladio, surrounded by the old monasteries. Now, I think the monks up until then had not yet decided whether to demolish it or not. This is the architectural mentality of the monks who tended to keep the presbytery of the church as long as possible, gradually demolishing the cloister and replacing them with new ones. In Santa Giustina in Padua, for example, any project always planned to keep the choir of the medieval church. I think is it this uncertainty over the fate of the older choir that explain the subsequent events in the construction of a Palladio church. A second wooden choir was overbuilt in the terminal section of the main nave, but it was demolished in 1579 to make the new high altar visible according to the dictates of the Council of Trent. This circumstance triggered a series of transformations which led between the last part of the 16th century to the demolition of what remained of the pre-existing church. The few design drawings we have do not allow us to verify this reconstruction beyond a shadow of a doubt. This plan, for example, describes a situation in which the choir already exists beyond the high altar. And I believe that this drawing is not by Palladio. And however, this drawing provides important information about the other problem that Palladio had to face, the design and construction of the facade. It is clear that the two columns of the pronaos and the steps were added later. The ink and the lean lines are different, and the color of the background is different. Furthermore, the columns are not aligned with the pillar inside. However, this drawing must be analyzed together with another one, certainly by Palladio and preserved at the Royal Institute of British Architects. This new drawing depicts a grandiose facade organized according to the compositional principle of two architectural orders. You can see here. It was a very monumental solution that was consistent with the Benedictine mentality of constructing large buildings with a great impact of the urban space. You can see. But, however, they associate does not associate their corresponding plan with this semi-elevation. For this reason, you can see we have different organization of the major order in these two different drawing. For this reason, we cannot know for certain whether the vertical elements were pilaster, half columns, or columns. In particular, we cannot determine whether the four supports of the main order were attached to the wall or whether they formed a three-dimensional pronaos. In short, Palladio's particular way of representing architecture based on the principle of geometric projection allows the design to be interpreted both a two-dimensional facade, as in Palladian facades of San Francesco della Vigna or Il Redentore, and as a three-dimensional one. I think that with this design, Palladio wanted to give the Benedictine a double project. The Benedictine had not yet decided whether to demolish the cloister, which still appears in some late sorry, in some late figures by other authors. And evidently, at the time of Palladio did, they had not yet decided whether the build of a facade partially covered by a cloister, as in medieval church, or directly overlooking San Mark basin. The analysis of another drawing, which has been little studied to date, could confirm that the possibility of a two-dimensional or three-dimensional facade remained open until the very end. This is a drawing that shows the work of several different people, rich in information and multi-layered. In particular, the internal structure elements are drawn with several alternatives, and if someone were reflecting on the internal proportions of the building, clearly, this could suggest an initial design phase. This circumstance would have been an important repercussion of the dating of the cloister, probably designed by Palladio. I don't think that this drawing is by Palladio, and perhaps it was made after his death. But the scale was certainly drawn by one of the Palladio collaborators. In any case, his analysis supported the hypothesis of a double alternative design of the Palladio. However, from the beginning of the construction site, the Benedictine postponed the construction of the facade in order to keep the two opposite cloisters as long as possible. Indeed, as evidenced by a document in 1595, Michele Veneto, out of San Giorgio Maggiore, had purchased 12 Verona stone columns for the construction of a quadriportico for the church. This portico would have kept the memory of the pre-existing cloister and would certainly have conditioned the shape of the facade, which would have lost the pronounce designed by Palladio. Meanwhile, for more than 30 years, Palladio Church was partially covered by the medieval cloister, as evidenced, like shown before, by many graphic sources. This is just one of the many episodes inherent in the debate on the construction of the church, which, as we know, involved leading political figures such as Marcantonio Barbaro and Leonardo Donà. In fact, the facade was finally built between 1607 and 1610, thanks to intervention of Leonardo Donà, who promoted the demolition of the western part of the medieval monastery. Yet the Doge will transform the facade of the church into a scenic backdrop on the urban scale, and is perfectly congruent with the use of monumental facade, which was typical of the Cassinese church. In this case, therefore, the political monastic mentality literally crushed the architect's project. Ultimately, in my opinion, Palladio who was tasked with a building program developed by the monks, but not yet finalized at the time of his death, came up with a flexible design. The church design was constrained by two factors. On the one hand, there was the need to respect the existing buildings that completely surrounded the site where the church was to build. On the other hand, there was indecision at the time the construction site opened about whether the preserved existing choir to the east and the medieval cloister to the west. Palladio thus created an open project where someone else could have made the final decision in this place, thus implicitly laying the foundation of Palladianism. Thanks for your attention.